An established voice for many years in the Houma area belonged to Rod Rodrigue, who provided colorful French and English programming at KHOM for some 15 years. Let's get caught up with Rod and look back at his broadcast history. Rod Rodrigue, how are you today?
Doing fine, enjoying retirement.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd safe to assume you're from our area originally?
Right, I'm from Chack Bay.
All right. And
Raised in Chack Bay.
so did you also go to Thibodeau High?
I went to Thibodeau High, I sure did. I went to St. Joseph Seminary. I graduated from there, and I was also went back in those days with SLI. It's now ULL. It's changed names 3 or 4 times. And then I spent 4 years in the Air Force. And when I got to the Air Force, that's when I moved to Houma. And I worked at the Houma Courier, and then I went to work for KCIL and eventually KHOM and KTIB.
Okay. What was the first year you started at the Courier?
At the Courier was 1958.
What kind of, did you just cover general news or?
Oh, I covered everything. That's one thing, you got a lot of experience. You did it. I covered the police beat, the police jury meeting, the school board meetings. They even had a hospital column where you visited everybody in the hospital once a week. So I got to know a lot of people in a very short amount of time. Okay.
Well, how'd you get the opportunity to go from newspaper into radio?
Well, I'll be frank with you. Newspaper is really a lot of work, and it's. I had worked for newspaper before. I worked at the Victoria while I was in the Air Force. I was a headline editor at Victoria Advocate in Victoria, Texas, and I got out the Air Force. It was that's when the recession back in '58, the oil field was dead, and there weren't too many jobs available. And with my newspaper experience, I went to the Courier and I went to work there, but I really didn't like it. I really enjoyed radio, however.
Right. So that about what would have been your first year when you first went to KCIL?
I went to KCIL as just a regular disc jockey, and I ended up as a manager of the FM station. KCIL was AM and FM. And back in those days, FM was strictly easy listening, mostly automated. And when I became manager, I switched from an automated station to a country music station, and it really got popular. You know, back in those days, the FM didn't have much advertising. There weren't too many people who had FM radios, I guess, and so AM was really the media that people listened to. But when I went with country music, I mean, here is what people liked in this area. It was very, very popular.
So at what point did you make the transition over to KHOM?
I went to KHOM back when KCIL, KGIM, the owner, Mr. Brannon, he bought the TV stations. And it looks like everybody from the radio station went over to TV. I was asked, but I didn't feel like it was for me. So I just quit over there, and I went to see Ray Sadie about a job. And he said, Rod, I don't think I can afford you, because FM, like I said, in those days wasn't a very good media. I mean, it's profitable. But I said, well, I'll tell you what, let me go to work for you. I'll go strictly on commission, providing I can do my French show. At the time, I was doing a French show on KCIL. And KHOM in those days was easy listening, and you can imagine how Raymond kind of really frowned when I said that. But I said, well, it's not that bad. I said, you come on at 6 o'clock, why don't you let me do my French show from 4:30 to 6? You're not on the air anyway. And so we struck up a deal, and I went to work there, and I stayed there 15 years, very successful years.
Very much so. Now, of course, I know there's like you just mentioned earlier, you've met so many people living down here all your life, and so many great artists as well. All the years that you did your French show, were there any artists that you would you consider favorites?
Oh, yes. I really like all at first, let me point out, when I first started doing the French show, I didn't particularly care for French music. But after a while, it grew on me. And I got real interested in it. In fact, so much so that later on I opened up a recording studio. And I'm the one that recorded L.J. Fauré, Jean Rodrigue, Cliff Fonseca, so well, about a dozen or so different French artists here. Before then, nobody except for Ben Bruce was about the only Cajun artist that we had in this area. And really, French music wasn't that popular, but after I did the show and people started getting interested, I might say at the present, you have as many Cajun bands here as they do in the Lafayette area. Back in those days, you didn't have any Cajun bands at all in this area. But it's really, I think I played a big part in promoting the Cajun music in this area.
Very much so. I'd like to ask you about some of the good folks along the years that you worked with at KHOM. And one gentleman who spoke very highly of you and who's now living in the Maryland area, Rick Fauché.
Oh, yes, indeed. Rick and Rick usually followed me in the morning. I opened up the station at 4 o'clock, and naturally, when he got in, I had the coffee beard, and we got to be real good friends. Rick, I've seen many fine people go through. Rick was one of them. Dave McNamara was another one that really went places. KHOM was a training ground for a lot of good journalists and people who went up in the TV and radio field.
Very much so. I believe another gentleman who would have been there at the time before he went to Alexandria in New Orleans, Ken Berthelot.
Yes, he sure was.
Mm-hmm. And but there's one person I definitely not want to forget, someone who's been an established broadcaster in our area for decades, Marie Bergeron.
Yes, indeed. Marie was she was the reason why there were so many people listening. We were really the news radio station. I mean, when people really depended on KHOM and KTIB for news. We were real big in news. And we had developed a real good audience. Mm-hmm. And being 100,000 watts, too, which made it real good for us. I'll never forget, my slogan was that broadcasting was 100,000 watts de pouvoir pour couvrir plus de territoire. We had 100,000 watts of power to cover more ground, more territory. And I've mentioned that a lot.
And of course, when we mentioned Marie, the one great thing about her is that she was so honest and well liked with people, and of course that naturally drew so many more people to KHOM.
Right. And I'll tell you who else was a big draw for us, and because he was with us before KTIB and KHOM were owned by Sadie and his group. That was Leroy Martin. I worked many remotes with Leroy Martin on KTIB, even though I was mostly at KHOM. On Saturdays, Leroy and I worked a lot of remote broadcasts on Saturday afternoon. He'll be in and several other places.
I take it without a doubt, down here you probably couldn't find a more colorful character to work with.
Oh, yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, indeed.
Let's also mention another gentleman who really established his name well in news as well as in music, Roy Vicknair.
Oh, he's really, Roy has been terrific, I'm telling you. He's so dependable, and of course, we like to tease him a lot, man. He was the guy that we really teased a lot while we were working over there. Mm-hmm. And but he was a great fellow to work with. We really had a good bunch of people, and let's not forget Ray said he was a good boss.
Mm-hmm. And of course,
I enjoyed working for him.
Of course, him, is the active manager for a long time, and Mr. Buquet and Mr. Watkins as well.
Right, so they were just silent on us about Lady ran the show. I mean, he was great. To work for.
When I talked to Rick Fauché, I mentioned your name. He had mentioned something else about you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but he said, wasn't there many times that the station was going through either a tropical system or a weather situation that you would often go out to the tower to make sure that it was okay?
Oh, yes, indeed. And sometimes we broadcast from the tower. Mm-hmm. And I'd do the French part, and Rick or somebody else would do the English part. Because Terrebonne Parish had a lot of people that didn't speak English back then, and that was the only way that they had the news was in French. So whenever we had hurricanes or anything, we did both French and English. And one of the best things that I really am proud of in my work at KHOM was back in, I forgot it was the late 70s or early 80s. I was chosen of the Radio France in Paris had a festival of the French language. I was broadcasted throughout the world, and the State Department chose me to represent the United States at that event, and I was had a 10-day all-expense-paid trip to Radio France and did a couple of broadcasts over Radio France. And I mean, that's quite an honor, I think, for both the station and myself personally. I think I was recommended by Coderfield out of Lafayette, because most French broadcasters here, they speak strictly Cajun French, but I had taken French in college, and I had some knowledge of classical French, so it made it easier for me to carry on over there.
Wow, it sounds like that must have been just rather overwhelming.
All right, it was. I mean, the French people really treated me very well, but in spite of the fact that they don't particularly care for the United States, but I wasn't from the United States. I was from Louisiana. They treated me as if they're still on Louisiana. I was really treated well.
Okay. I'd like to ask you about a couple other folks, some of them remaining more KTIB than KHOM. I'd like to get your opinion on a gentleman who I think really lasted a good while in the 70s and 80s, Roy Pugh.
Roy Pugh. Roy, I never worked that close with Roy, but Roy was a real good fellow. He worked closely with the sports at first, and then he eventually became manager, but I never actually worked very much. He was kind of the latter part of the time when I was at KHOM. I left KHOM, by the way, in 1984 and went in business for myself at Rod Superstore,
which, of course, is an establishment on Barrow Street.
Right.
Very well.
My success, I think KHOM, KTIB contributed a lot to it, because when I went in business, everybody knew me. And so I had a very, very successful business, and my son is still carrying it on very successfully.
Did you know Les Domingue?
Oh, yes. Yes was after me. Les Domingue, and the one that was before me was E.J. Dugas, who was quite a personality in his own right. I mean, he really conducted a very, very good French show, very, very well liked, had a good audience.
Now, I know along the years, I know you didn't cover in radio. You may not be as known for news, but all the years that you were at KHOM, were there any incidents or any stories that seemed to ring in your mind the most that you were at the station to cover?
Not really, except for the hurricanes and things like that. We covered that. I personally carried a lot of that, and of course election returns too. There again, in most cases, whenever there was a big story to cover, like election returns and the hurricanes and so forth, we did it in both French and English. Most of the time was Roy did the English, Roy Rodrigue did the English, and I did the French.
I tell you what, it sounds like through all the years in radio and all the people you've gotten to know, and it's really good to know you still have so many great fond memories of working at KHOM.
Yes, indeed. In fact, like I said, I attribute my success later on in business to the fact that the experience and the people that I met through KHOM and KTIB, and also KCIL.
Well, listen, I really greatly appreciate your time, and before we head on out, is there anything you'd like to say to all our listeners?
No, I just want to thank them for the many good years they gave me. I enjoyed doing the French program, and I'd like also to mention my advertisers, because while I was doing the French show, what most people knew me because of the French show, I was also sales manager at KHOM. Sold advertising. That's where that was the money part of my job, and I really had a lot of good clients, and I'd like to thank them also. All the many good people that advertised through me on KHOM and KTIB.
Well, very much so, because there's a lot of people, a lot of our listeners may or may not know, without those good people behind the scenes, such as yourself, and engineers and marketing people, it's very hard to keep a radio station afloat without them.
I might mention that when I left KCIL, went to KHOM with that French program, from one day to the next, 100% of my advertisers followed me over to KHOM.
That really sounds like they really had a lot of loyalty for you.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I tell you what, that's good to know. It's always good to have friends everywhere.
That's true.
Very true. Well, once again, Rod, I really appreciate all your time and sharing memories with us.
Thanks to all of you at KTIB now for keeping up the tradition of news. In fact, for now, the only place you can get local news is KTIB.
Rod Rodrigue, a man whose valuable contributions are part of KHOM. The early 2000s provided listeners with the voice of Shane Warner. While his stay was brief, his memories of KTIB are numerous. Shane Warner, how are you today?
Pretty good, William.
Well, let's start from the beginning. Where are you originally from?
Well, I spent a little bit of time in all corners of the country. Growing up, I spent time in Seattle, moved to Virginia, New Orleans, back to Virginia, Mississippi. So I've been a couple different places. I spent a lot of time between New Orleans and Virginia growing up. So that's kind of where I get my Louisiana ties from.
Okay. Well, tell me, was going into broadcasting a dream of yours when you were a kid?
No, this is something that came about. I went to college for, I guess, a year or two. I had no clue of what I wanted to do. I was interested in a little bit of everything, and I couldn't pick something. So I was listening to the radio down here in New Orleans one day, and I figured, I can do that. So I went back. I got one degree in communication and broadcasting, and I got another in history as just kind of a hobby, as something to supplement that